One moment so that you won't be confused. I'm Lori Damrosch. I'm the president of the American Society of International Law. As this is our closing... Thank you. As this is our closing plenary for the 2015 annual meeting, I thought it would be appropriate for me to open it. Just to say a few words. First of all, it's a tradition at the annual meeting to reserve a place or two for the late-breaking events or the hot topics. Last year, you'll remember that we were racing to put together a panel on Crimea a day or two after the annexation had happened. And this year, as the very most intensive phase of the preparations for the annual meeting were taking place, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence released its report on torture, and the UN Committee Against Torture in approximately the same time frame released its concluding observations on the report of the United States. So even though torture is a problem that has been with us for centuries, and the knowledge of practices undertaken by persons of U.S. authority has been known for also a very long time, it was a late-breaking topic in the context in which we had been putting together this annual meeting. And it was a late-breaking topic that posed a number of sensitivities, political and otherwise, for trying to put together a program. And so I want, as my final act for this year's annual meeting, just once again to thank the program committee, the 3 program committee co-chairs, several of them I think are here, and all the members of the program committee who helped us brainstorm this event and put together a panel that we hope will be enlightening for you, and that we'll do what we always try to do at the ASIL annual meetings, namely elevate the debate and get away from some of the partisan mudslinging and get back to what we really think are the core issues of what are the international legal obligations of the United States, how are those international legal obligations defined and clarified, how are they implemented, is the implementing structure in the United States adequate? And so we want it to be a forward-looking panel, and so that's the spirit in which we have constituted it. I also want to say that in the newsletter that has been released a week or so ago, which has a presidential column, that's mine, and it says January through March, which was when I was preparing it, but it was released around April 1st, and I think you can probably pick it up at the ASIL table. I talked a little bit in the column about the 2 reports that were issued in late 2014, but I also looked back to what this organization, the American Society of International Law, has done about torture. And although we are an institution that almost never takes policy positions and almost never intervenes on issues of controversy, we do have a mechanism prescribed by our Constitution and regulations for coming together in a single voice, as we did at our centennial annual meeting in 2006, and we adopted a resolution expressing the sense of the American Society of International Law that included a few passages on the torture issue as it was then current, and that is the sense of the American Society of International Law, reprinted in this newsletter, and it remains the sense of the American Society of International Law governing us from our centennial meeting in 2006 until time immemorial. So with those as the opening words, I will put the Elisa Massimino name card here and turn it over to Elisa to moderate the program. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. Thank you. Thanks so much, Lori, and thank you so much to the American Society of International Law for making room for this important topic and for having focused so much attention on it over the years. I think this is a critical issue, not just for our country, but for the integrity of international law. So I'm very pleased, and I think it's very appropriate that we're closing out the meeting by focusing on it. And I also want to thank all of you for being in a windowless room on this glorious spring morning to talk about torture. It really takes a special kind of person to flock to to hear a discussion about this not very nice subject. But we're very, very fortunate to have three real giants on international law and these issues in particular with us to help kick off this conversation, and what I hope will be a conversation, an interactive conversation. As Lori mentioned, there's been a lot of heat around this issue, and there was a lot of heat around the release of the Senate Intelligence Committee, the executive summary of the Senate Intelligence Committee's report. The report itself, I think, finally sheds a fair amount of light on what happened and how it happened. But whatever you think about the report, how it was done, its scope, or whether we'll ever see the full report, actually, the point of this conversation really is to figure out what, now that we know a bit more, if not everything, what does that mean for U.S. domestic law on torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment? And what are the implications for international law, looking back and trying to learn some lessons from the last dozen years or so. Here's how it's going to work. Well, let me just ask first, how many people know about the Senate Intelligence Committee report, know what it... Okay, good. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about what it is or how... There's a 6,900-page report that was launched with a bipartisan vote. That's the executive summary, which is about 500 pages. That's what's been released. It's quite heavily redacted, but I've read it, and it's certainly possible to glean quite a bit of new information from the report, even for somebody who's followed these issues very closely. So I think the report itself, which was launched with a bipartisan vote, adopted by the Senate Intelligence Committee in a bipartisan vote, and released pursuant to a bipartisan vote, is a very, very significant oversight, exercise of oversight by Congress, and there's a lot to learn from it. As I said, there was a lot of heat generated around the release of the report in the way that kind of typical cable news fashion, which likes to set up a gladiator fight between, it's not exactly where you go to get enlightened about international law, but more about a fight between, a partisan fight between Democrats and Republicans, a fight between the executive branch and the Congress and all of that. But today we're going to try to see what lessons can we learn, both from the report and also, as Lori said, from the role of the United Nations Committee Against Torture and its wisdom in terms of evaluating the United States' performance under the treaty. Torture is obviously a big global problem, and it continues to be a problem, and as I'm sure we'll hear from Dean Grossman. It's certainly not a problem only for the United States, and it's not a problem only, or even perhaps most significantly, in the context of national security. But in particular because of the leadership role that the United States has played historically on setting the leading on human rights standards, I think it's particularly important how the United States decides to grapple with this problem. So let me stop there and introduce our three speakers, who will each give just a brief opening remarks of no more than 10 minutes, and I will make sure I time that. And then I'll kick it off with a few questions, and I bet that you might have a few questions. So we'll try to make it interactive, including, I want to say, amongst the panelists. So if you want to address each other, it's not like a congressional testimony. You can just talk to each other as well, and I would love to hear that. So they're very distinguished, and I don't want to take up too much time introducing them, but I'll start first with John Norton Moore, who's all the way to my far right. Who is a professor of law at the University of Virginia, where he directs the Center for National Security Law and the Center for Oceans Law and Policy. John has written extensively on international law and these issues. He has served as a political appointee on a number of executive branch commissions over many, many years. And interestingly, although I don't know if he's going to talk about it, but he brought the first case against a foreign government for the torture of United States citizens. So that's a very interesting perspective. And then just to the left of John is Alberto Mora, who I should, in full disclosure, say is a member of the board, a proud member, and we're very proud to have him a member of the board of Human Rights First, my organization. Alberto, many of you know, he's currently senior fellow at the Carr Center at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He started his career, but even before law school, as a foreign service officer, which I think is a very interesting perspective to have on these issues, and I hope he'll share some of that too. He has received numerous awards and honors. In particular, I just want to note that he was the recipient of the JFK Library Foundation Profile in Courage for his work on these issues in particular. So he was a political appointee in both the George H.W. Bush administration and served as general counsel of the Navy. That's when he and I first met in the George W. Bush administration. And Claudia Grossman, who is professor of law and dean at American University Washington College of Law. Again, so much leadership over many, many years on international human rights issues and broader international law issues. But most importantly, for today's discussion, he was reelected about a year ago to an unprecedented fourth term as chair of the UN Committee Against Torture, a position that he has held, I think, since 2008, maybe. And so a very important perspective for us as we think about the integrity of international law and what the United States and other countries should be doing to strengthen the prohibition against torture. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to John to get us started, and then we'll just go in order. And if you go longer than 10 minutes, I'm going to give a little knock on the table to give you a warning. All right, John, over to you.
Elisa is correct that the United States historically has been one of the leaders in the world in insisting on humanitarian treatment during wartime and also in opposing torture. We've done that going all the way back to the Lieber Code, of course, at the time of the United States Civil War. How then did we have such terrible activities that took place, such as My Lai in the Vietnam War, or more recently, the Torture Light program during the George W. Bush administration that was referred to as enhanced interrogation? And in dealing with those issues, I would like to simply address 2 points. One, I'm going to talk a little bit about the national security costs of torture. And secondly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the pathways to torture and how it happened in the United States in those 2 instances that I think capture most of the settings in which at least governmental officials in security settings are likely to have encountered this problem. Now, frequently those that engage in torture believe they're the tough guys. They're really going to be aiding national security of their country. They know how to do it. Everybody else is really kind of weak and really just doesn't get it. Well, nothing could be more naive and mistaken in relation to the actual national security goals of any country in the world engaged in serious defense and national security issues. I'm going to quickly run through at least 9 costs of an illegal torture program that was undertaken in both of those settings. First, it serves as a recruiting posters for our enemies, as the CIA very clearly indicated subsequently. Secondly, it undermines democratic support for the war effort at home, which is a critical front, as Clausewitz told us many years ago. The third is it alienates our allies and reduces the alliance structure. The fourth is that it deters critical intelligence cooperation from other countries and intelligence agencies. The fifth is that it increases the likelihood that United States POWs and others held by the enemy will be tortured and abused. The sixth is that it hugely interferes with the ability of the United States to provide leadership generally in foreign affairs, and particularly in human rights and rule of law matters. The seventh is it puts at risk the brave men and women in the intelligence services and in the defense community of the United States of subsequent criminal prosecution and possibly civil prosecution under universal jurisdiction. Under the CAT, it is very, very clear in Article 2, Para 3, that no kind of top-level excusing or ordering can excuse torture. So possibly for purposes of domestic national security prosecutions, a presidential finding of some sort saying it's okay might be adequate, one would suspect, though the constitutional issue remains unclear, to prevent domestic prosecution, but that would not prevent prosecution of any of these individuals, fine Americans doing their job, from being prosecuted universally in other countries or in relation to potential civil actions against them elsewhere. And finally, this is something that basically also reduces the incentive of enemy actors basically to come over and defect and voluntarily give us information. That is a huge set of cost to be undertaking for a very naive kind of sense that this is the tough thing to do. And I haven't even talked about the questionable efficiency of all of this, because our agencies that really engage effectively in interrogation in the United States and do it for a living, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was strongly at odds with the others that were engaged in these activities, and basically said this was extremely naive. The issue is not whether or not during the enhanced interrogation you got some information. Of course you likely did. The real question is whether normal interrogation methods are more effective. And the FBI in the United States had basically a war with the CIA on this and others. We generated a great deal of interagency dispute, and of course the entire military. The military JAG Corps strongly opposed to all this because they were the ones that had the background on it. Okay, what are the pathways to torture? How has this happened? And I think it's very simple. There are two pathways. One is bottom-up and the other is top-down. The bottom-up pathway is what happened in Vietnam. The United States at that time solidly was opposed to any kind of violations of laws of war, but we had an out-of-control second lieutenant and very poor guidance from his captain, and the result was a horrible massacre, probably the worst, well, certainly one of the worst in United States military history, at My Lai. And what do you do about the bottom-up? It's pretty simple. You engage in training, effective training, as is required by Article 10 of the CAT. And in addition to that, you prosecute when there are violations. We didn't do the prosecution very well of Lieutenant Calley. He was pardoned in the end. He was prosecuted, but not very effectively in my mind. I was part of a State Department advisory group that was advising the Secretary of State on it, and every single member of that group said there should be effective prosecution in that setting. So the main thing there is to get good people. We also had a failure, I think, in terms of the caliber of the officer corps. We had been going down to a lower caliber officer at that point, and we failed to provide good training. Subsequently, the United States military, after that, learned. It created the field of operational law, and it became the best in the world in the training, and you saw that during the Gulf War subsequently. That brings us to the torture light policies. What happened there? This was simply top-down, in my judgment. This was not a few rogue actors. This was at a very high level within the United States government, likely particularly involved in relation to the Vice President's office and in relation to the Secretary of Defense office, though no investigation has ever really thoroughly been done about it. What were some of the background causes of that failure at a very top level? I would suggest that one of those, of course, that set the framework, as it always does in security crises, is a major national crisis. That's always there. And we make some serious mistakes in those settings, as we did during the Supreme Court acceptance of the incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II. And so we understand these are times when terrible mistakes are made, but that does not justify them. And why did we make those mistakes? And I think the first problem here was there was a failure of the normal lawyering process in the National Security Council structure. It had been my privilege to serve in the NSC, chairing a committee of that for some years, and the NSC and the ability of all of our government officials to work together in their understanding of these issues is absolutely extraordinary. What happened here is a small group of lawyers, led primarily from the Vice President's office, basically took charge of the process and ignored the professional military and professional foreign service and advice from the principal agencies that had dealt in the past with these issues. To my knowledge, none of those lawyers had had a course in national security law. I do not believe that, for the most part, they were strong supporters of international law. In fact, I think one of the problems is they were operating in a climate that was anti-international law at the same time. And so the result is terrible mistakes were made. What do you do then about that? And let me go 1 minute to give you the answers to that. You know, Mr. Justice Holmes was said to have the ability to shut off a speaker in the middle of the word if. And I didn't know that Elisa was that
I'm not
good.
quite that powerful.
Okay, in any event, first we need to train the lawyers well. Those that get these positions need to be trained well. We need to go back and structure the NSC legal process well so that we're not, for example, doing something unusual like the lawyer to the vice president being the one basically that's particularly influential in the operation of that process. And we need to, as this society does so well, train the country, train our people in understanding the enormous importance of the rule of law and international law and everything we do, because that was part of the climate here that permitted the problem. I also believe that it would have been useful here for the president when he came in to have set up a truth commission, to have actually looked at the entire problem and where it originated, and do so with a process that would have been compulsory process in it. These are enormously serious. It will take years for the United States to overcome this. This panel is very appropriate in looking at an extraordinarily serious mistake made by one of the most wonderful democratic rule of law supporting countries in the history of the world. Thank you.
Elisa, thank you for the invitation, and delighted to be here at ASIL, and delighted to be here with these distinguished men and women on the panel. The theme of the panel is looking forward, but of course, as in any issue of justice, you really can't look forward without looking backwards. Justice is almost necessarily retrospective by definition, which is why the call that we've heard from the president and others to say we need to look forward doesn't really make much sense. It's somewhat nonsensical given the structure of these matters. There's a lot to talk about, but let me start with the Senate Intelligence Committee report, because I think despite the controversy that attends it, the one thing I think that has been reasonably settled, or at least settled to the minds of reasonable people, is that the abuse inflicted on the individuals through the use of enhanced interrogation was torture. I think there's no longer a reasonable debate as to whether or not the level of abuse reached that kind of level. And for those who might be wondering about this or interested in pursuing it further, I refer you to reading those portions of the report that deal with the application of the techniques, singly or in combination, to the various detainees. So I think that issue has been settled. Having said that, however, I think it's important to remind ourselves that the legal standard and the international human rights standard is not whether we torture, but whether we apply cruelty. And unfortunately, the terminology of this debate has settled on the word torture, which is inherently distorting of the standard that we are seeking to establish or to maintain, reestablish and maintain. Now, although we're a society of international lawyers and are focused, understandably, primarily on the international aspects of this, the issue of torture is really a combination of various different categories of activities. There's a law, there is policy, and John touched on some of the elements of policy, but there's also politics. And there's really no way to really address the issue of torture without addressing simultaneously all three dimensions of the issue of torture, because they're all equally important. And in fact, it could be argued that the politics of this may be as important, or maybe the starting point to these discussions, because among the damage created by our use of torture, and actually let me take a moment then to talk about the categories of damage, because when you think about the damage done by our decision to use torture and the application of torture, there was damage, of course, to the victims, there was damage to the law and our constitutional order, there was damage to international law, there was damage to the architecture of human rights, there was damage to our foreign policy, and there was damage to our national security strategy and our national security period. So these are categories of areas of damages where we need to understand what happened and then determine whether or not corrective action needs to be taken in each of these categories and then proceed forward. There was damage to all of these categories. And the failure then to continue looking at this and to provide corrective measures will continue to hurt the United States in a number of ways that are not perfectly understood by most Americans, who in some cases have moved on and in some cases haven't really understandably grasped the dimension of and the consequences of our action. Now, to touch briefly about what are some of my principal concerns among many others. But the first would start with the definition of torture, because I think that the use of the euphemisms like enhanced interrogation for over a decade have distorted and fractured American understanding as to what abuse consists of and the damage that it can do, and also served to mask the reality that the level of abuse was illegal, both because it constituted cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, but also because in many cases it reached the level of torture. So restoring a sense of the definition and restoring the proper definition and the proper law to govern applied abuse is an important first step going forward in terms of healing the damage created by our use of torture. The second is that, related to this, is that we've shattered the national consensus against cruelty and torture. Before 9/11, as is well known, all polling indicated that the vast majority of the American people were united behind the principle that the United States simply does not abuse individuals in captivity. It's simply something we don't do as a matter of our national values, our statutes and laws, and our constitutional order. I mean, this was settled debate, not only settled within the legal universe, but also settled within the military, for example, as a matter of national security strategy and policy for the reasons that John articulated. Well, that consensus is now shattered, and almost half of the American people are of the view that torture could be used and should be used if it could make us safer. And the problem with this, of course, is that there will be other terrorist attacks. We will incur additional casualties. And when that happens, the voices of those who implemented the architecture of torture in the first place, or those who are sympathetic to its logic, will rise up again and say we should go back to those techniques. In fact, President Obama, when he prohibited the use of torture in his second day in office, was accused by some of the earlier architects of this policy of having disarmed the United States and made us weaker, and having preemptively accused them of having caused American casualties in anticipation of future terrorist attacks. Well, that argument will be had again in the future, and it's better to make decisions now as to where American policies and laws should be when we're not dealing with the grief and the anger of another terrorist attack. So this is politics, but it's vitally important because it underlies the content of our laws and our willingness to enforce them and observe them. Another point is what John mentioned, which is the loss of U.S. credibility and moral authority on human rights. The vocation of the United States is to protect human dignity. The arc of our foreign policy is to protect human dignity overseas and to help construct a world in which human dignity is preserved in ever-increasing increments. And this has been a policy that's been extraordinarily successful for the United States in combination with many other countries. We're here to make the world less cruel, not more cruel. And implicitly, the use of torture by the United States, of course, worked against this overarching foreign strategy objective of the United States, and repairing the damage and restoring our credibility, restoring our focus on the strategic prize is important. But we at Harvard are looking, as John is, into the policy consequences of our use of torture. And what you see in WikiLeaks cables all over the world and many other places is the fact that we attempt to engage in human rights discussions with leaders ever since we started applying these tortures, and many of these leaders would refuse to even engage us or have a discussion because they felt that we lacked the moral credibility to address the issue at all. So this is something you will find embedded in many of the WikiLeaks cables reporting on human rights and political events around the country. We need to restore our credibility, and we need to restore momentum because it's important to the structure of human rights and to their observance around the world. If we don't do it, few others will pick up the slack. Legal education, John touched at this point as well. What is very hopeful at Harvard is that there's a group of students that have recognized the fact that a number of Harvard law graduates, were among the architects of the U.S. policy on torture, and they're wondering how Harvard failed. And so they've engaged the administration of the law school in a discussion as to what can we do to ensure that there is not a failure of legal professionalism, as simple as that in some respects, meaning that people who read the law prohibiting the application of abuse will not come to conclusions that, in fact, the law permits the application of abuse. But second of all, how do we instill in the graduates of the law school then a sense of moral compass such that people which will be confronted by these issues will understand better how to approach the problem of human dignity and protecting individuals from torture. If this movement takes hold, then I think Harvard could be a leader in having a reevaluation of the content of legal education, learning from the lessons of our use of torture in the near future. I'm sure I'm running out of time, so let me leave you with one last thought, skipping ahead. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani was in town 2 weeks ago and spoke before the Congress and spoke before the U.S. Institute of Peace, and then also in the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. In both places, he went out of his way to praise Senator Feinstein for the courage and the accomplishment of having led the Sisi report on interrogation to completion, indicated that he had been shocked to read the report, in fact, that he had stayed up awake all night when he first got a copy of it because he couldn't sleep after reading the accounts of the report. He called for accountability of the two American psychologists who were the principal architects of the report, and then embedded that call for accountability within a larger vision of transitional justice for Afghanistan. And what he said was, the Taliban are political opponents. They're not the enemy. And some of them have legitimate grievances, including the grievance of having been tortured in some cases, both by Americans and by Afghans. Taking those grievances seriously means that we need to understand what happened to them and then make reparations or restitution of some sort. But what's clear here is that President Afghan views the use of torture, both Afghan and American in Afghanistan, as not only something that damaged the individuals who were victimized by it, but damaged the politics in Afghanistan and constitutes an obstacle towards the reconciliation of the warring parties in Afghanistan, and the understanding of this issue as a necessary step along the way towards a reduction of the violence and then the repair and restitution of Afghanistan. So this should give us pause as to the damage that we caused inadvertently through the use of torture, but also the need for continuing to focus on how to address the damage created by it so as to improve the situation in that country, which is of such great vital national interest to the United States. And I'll stop there.
First of all, I'm also very pleased to be here in the company of two distinguished personalities in the realm of international law, and be here on the occasion of a conversation with all of you organized by the Society on this important topic. Some general comments in light of what my colleagues have said. The first thing, the United States play a very important role in shaping international law, interpreting universally held values in crucial areas. And one of the, let me see, victims of 9/11 is not only the credibility of the United States and in addition to the impact on many men and women in the world, but the result is also an erosion of international human rights law. And from that perspective, many events that we see today in the world could be linked perhaps to the war against terror and the reaction of 9/11. When the United States presented to the Committee Against Torture its report, Mary McLeod said, in the wake of 9/11 attacks, we regrettably did not always live up to our own values, including those reflected in the convention. And as President Obama has acknowledged, we crossed the line and we take responsibility for that. Those are very important statements, including the presentation of the delegation of the U.S. of what was seen as an apology, and that's a way to repair under Article 14 of the Convention. But much more needs to be done in order to strengthen the values that we want in the international domain and ensure the type of future we would like to see, whether men and women could develop themselves to the limit of their possibilities under the rule of law. So what's at stake here are those things. There is another thing at stake. Based on my experience in the Inter-American Commission during 8 years and now in the Committee Against Torture since 2003, in the wake of attacks, we don't always live up to our own values. It's not something that happens in the United States. When we see under an emergency situations in the world, there is a reaction that with the scared populations, it's like when a domestic crime is committed, the skillful lawyers know very well that it's better to postpone the trial because the reaction of individuals is put them against the wall and kill them right away. So what I'm saying about this, the reason why we invented international law is that domestic system will fail in some situations. And then and that's why we have international law. Otherwise, the outer limit for the protection of human rights will be constitutions. We would not need international law. So as we address this issue, we need to understand what are the measures, domestic, that needs to be taken, but understand also the need to strengthen international law, and that's a work in progress. For example, in the area of torture, it becomes very important the ratification and enforcement of the optional protocol to a convention against torture, which is a new way of supervision. Because classical supervision was done by committees, like the Committee Against Torture, and have, to a certain extent, a post factum role when we see violation. There is also a role preventive, because when we expose things and we're effective on that, that has an impact in preventing situations. But the optional protocol invented a new mechanism, a national preventive mechanism that satisfies some conditions that can go without authorization to visit centers of detention. And also it becomes a partner in relationships with the subcommittee on prevention. Now, again, seems far away and idealistic to think that the conditions are here to do something like that. But I belong to a group that had to leave his native country in 1973, and Chile, and I remember when people thought that it would have been impossible, the detention of Pinochet in London. Somebody would have told me, I would have thought that's impossible. Or somebody would have told me that the Soviet Union would collapse and the wall will be over between Germany of the East and the West. The best way to shape the future is to work in the direction of the future. And I suggest that we need to recognize the limits of domestic law. It's very important. It's the first barrier in the implementation of norms of human rights. But also we need, as a society of international law and as we try to give leadership to the world, reinforce the powerful narrative of international human rights law that has been weakened lately due to many events. Now, what are the obligations laid down by the Convention as we get into a topic of what needs to be changed? We know the incorporation of definition of torture into domestic realm. There are issues, well, I will say what are the issues, recognize the non-derogability of torture, not extradite or return a person to a state where he or she would be in danger of torture, extradite or prosecute individuals alleged to have committed torture, prohibit the use of confession extracted through torture in any official proceeding, provide reparations to the victims, provide training. Not only torture is prohibited, but also, as you were saying, the cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment and punish. Issues that are important, and my experience after so many years is the following: conduct prompt, impartial, and effective investigation. You know, I have a conflict of interest here. I'm a dean of the law school. For us, it's very important training. I have seen something very impressive that perhaps questions our ability to train. Every time we investigate and punish in real time, everyone knows. That makes us obsolete, perhaps with training through numerous seminars. But when there is an investigation and punish, people know in real terms what's going on. Huh? So irrespective of that, of course, in addition, we need to use the proper mechanism and instrument. The Istanbul Protocol, for example, is very essential in this matter. Ensure the right to complain and have case examined. Conduct training and awareness raising. Bring interrogation techniques in line with the convention. Ensure redress and rehabilitation. Prevent gender-based violence. Ensure protection of women. Rejection of every type of discrimination, including discrimination for sexual orientation. I will mention this also based on my experience. It's very difficult to torture or submit to cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment and punishment only political cases. There is a way in which, if in a society there is a high degree or a certain degree of tolerance and impunity towards the way we treat the common criminals and situation of discrimination, that pervades. And there is a interconnectedness, because there are impacts also in the torture or inhuman treatment of political people in the political realm, and how that revert in terms or impact the situation of the society as a whole. We have seen that time and again. Announce visits by an independent body, improve data collection, torture, improve conditions on detention and overcrowding. Now, what were the recommendations of the Committee Against Torture concerning the U.S.? One, criminalize torture at the federal level. The whole story of human rights law in the United States has been related with federalization. And I don't need to explain to these learned audience why that has been the case. Not only the case of the US, Brazil, Mexico. I mean, the struggle for the human rights has been linked to a struggle for federalization of human rights norms. Then, considering withdrawing interpretations, understandings, and reservations that limit the scope of the convention. One, for example, that's again the bread and butter. Torture is not only physical, it's also emotional. And that one of the reservations states that it says that establish an extra qualifier, prolonged mental harm. The convention doesn't say prolonged mental harm. Prevent not only acts of torture in its sovereign territory, but all areas de jure or de facto under the control of the country. There have been important movements here. The fact that President Obama said no further torture, very important, and had an impact in the world. The fact that the delegation of the United States went to a committee against torture and announced that it will apply Article 16 in human treatment, not only in the territory of the United States, but any other area under governmental control, including Guantanamo, chips, and so on, has a very important impact. It's crucial to go all the way and say where effective control is exercised. All legal safeguards from the moment of detention, important, these are access to lawyers and access to doctors. No secret detention facilities that create a space for torture and so forth. Publication, the publication of the Senate report is very important and has, somebody said in Latin America, when there is a tremor in the United States, there is an earthquake. So that publication of the report has a powerful meaning in terms of sending a message. What is the current view of certain, of what needs to happen? Diplomatic assurances have been, there is a scope for diplomatic assurances, but it should not be a pretext for the purpose of sending people to places where they can be tortured. Judges and politicians cannot say what everyone knows. If somebody was sent to Egypt in the post 9/11, everyone knew that was to be tortured, not to be treated in accordance with Article 3 of the Convention, and no diplomatic assurance. They were sent to be tortured. They were not sent there for any other purpose. And people knew that. Then, ratification of the optional protocol, again, is something that needs to be thought. Well, I see my colleagues to my geographic left growing increasingly desperate for the purpose of having a communication. And I will say that I look forward to an exchange of views as to how we can proceed further in complying with these important values. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. So there's a lot of issues put on the table there. I wanted to, before I open it up to questions from the audience, just to say a couple of words about the legislative proposals that Senator Feinstein wrote to President Obama at the end of last year, suggesting a number of reforms, both legislative and administrative and oversight reforms, that flow directly from some of the things that we learned from the Senate Intelligence Committee report. I'm not going to read the letter to you, but I do think, there are recommendations of changes to U.S. law. In particular, I think to address one of the issues you raised, Dean Grossman, about prolonged mental harm. We know that there was some creative lawyering going on to kind of twist that language in order to give the veneer of legality to acts that were clearly out of bounds from the treaty. A number of recommendations about oversight, putting some of the steps that President Obama had put into place through the executive order, putting those into legislation, for example, prohibiting the CIA's detention program altogether so that the CIA is out of the business of detaining people, and legislating a requirement to notify the Red Cross and provide timely access to every detainee in U.S. custody, taking the Army Field Manual and legislating that as the standard, those kinds of things, in addition to some of the things Professor Moore suggested about training and change of procedures at the National Security Council. I mean, one of the things that was striking to me in reading the executive summary of the report was that many of the lawyers that were opining on these, the legality of this conduct, were not well informed. Either they were misled or they were not well informed about the conduct that was actually being contemplated or actually was being undertaken. And that's a clear disconnect. The constraints that some lawyers were under in their agencies, the lack of real evaluation in real time of what was happening within the intelligence agency. I came away thinking that if the CIA itself had been able to connect, or even tried to connect some of the dots that the Senate Intelligence Committee report did, it may have it may have ended the program far earlier for some of the reasons that Professor Moore said. So I have a lot of questions myself, but we have about 35 minutes, and I want to get questions from the audience first. So please identify yourself and line up. I guess do we only have one? It's all the way over here, so sorry for you guys in the corner. But please, Christina.
Thank you. My name is Christina Cerna. I'm retired from the OAS, where I spent over 30 years with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And I'm now an adjunct at Georgetown University Law Center. And I was appalled to learn recently that international law is not a required course at Georgetown or in most U.S. law schools. And I was fascinated to hear Alberto Mora say that at Harvard you have this group of law professors who are concerned about the content of legal education. How can these individuals who come out of elite schools not have an appreciation for international law or international human rights law? And I'm wondering if there is a recommendation coming out of this group that international law and international human rights law be obligatory on bar exams in the US, which would make it obligatory to teach in law schools, and if there's some way that the society can support this initiative, calling for the required teaching of these courses in American schools.
Thank you.
You know, actually, I welcome the question. The movement is led by students, actually, not professors yet, and the dialogue has just started now. So it's a little too early to say where it's going to end up. But I think you're exactly right. And in fact, your comment leads me to reflect or recall the observation of Louis Henkin, which we all know, that the United States is not a core supporter of international human rights. It's really a flying buttress supporting that. That there's our legal education, and this is often shocking to European lawyers when they talk to us about the issue of torture or other international legal issues. There's typically not a discussion about international law within the U.S. government when you address these kinds of issues that focuses purely on municipal law and how it applies or not. I personally would be very much a supporter in including, this is also part of the discussion here, more training on international law and more training on human rights and the relationship between human rights and American law in law schools. I think it's a gap in the educational system.
And I'd add that your idea of making it mandatory in U.S. schools and including it on the bar exam is a lovely idea. Many of us in international law have been pushing that for many years. But training, Alberto, and you were absolutely right, the training, both in terms of understanding the political component and political counseling, not just law, but also the legal point and the moral component. All of that is absolutely crucial, and it's a crucial part of legal education. And what we saw here, at least in the top-down setting here, was a very serious educational failure on the part of people at very high level.
Claudio?
Yeah, I think that putting some questions on about international law in the bar exams is long overdue. I mean, I wonder how people can practice law today without being exposed to that. First of all, there is hardly an issue that's purely domestic or purely international. I mean, it's what's purely domestic? Trade, torts, peace and security. I mean, everything is interconnected. So that's the first thing. So in order to measure the ability to practice, I think we need to test that knowledge. That's the first thing. Second thing, I'm a little bit hesitant to put international law as a compulsory course in law school. First of all, because I'm a little bit hesitant to give orders on anything. Every time that I try, my colleagues put me in my place. What remains is done by my family. But the key thing here is mainstreaming international law. For example, because otherwise, I mean, we always think too easily. We create there, we put international law, civil procedure, and problem solved. No. The key thing is to show the interconnectedness of things and how things are interrelated. Constitutional law has strong components of international law. Torts law, strong components. I mean, every property. I mean, everything is interconnected. So I think it's part of a more complex operation. Requires, again, perhaps I have a bias against this idea of putting as a compulsory course. But if we put that in the bar, that would create incentive. In my own school, we have over 40 courses per semester in international law, and over 60% go abroad. So we have created an environment, or tried to, where people are motivated to do it. Okay, that's my answer.
Yes, please.
Hi, Stephanie Ferrier, a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford and professor at Vermont Law School, and former legal director of Amnesty International during the Pinochet extradition hearings. And it was actually torture in under the Pinochet regime that led me to decide to pursue a law degree. As Christina knows, I'm a great supporter of requiring and incorporating international law into U.S. law courses. But keep in mind that the torture memos themselves, right, cited and relied heavily on Ireland versus United Kingdom, the European Court of Human Rights 1978 judgment. And in my view, quite misrepresented what it stood for. I think that anyone, even not trained in international law, who reads Ireland versus United Kingdom will understand that they might not have called it torture, although I think they should have, as the commission did. But the court came out quite strongly saying it, in fact, was cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, which also is illegal. But secondly, any lawyer, even not trained in international law, would certainly know to see what cases might have been decided in the interim. And the Selmouni case, Selmouni versus France, also made it quite clear that these sorts of techniques would now be understood to be torture. And as I think many in this room are aware, Ireland has now formally requested the European Court of Human Rights to reopen the case because of evidence that was withheld by the UK government when it was arguing the case before the European Court. There were explicit statements by the UK government that have now come forward where they themselves referred to the techniques as torture. So I think the European Court of Human Rights is most likely to at least formally proclaim what I think any lawyer, even not trained in international law, would have recognized constitutes torture.
Okay, I think that was, I'm not sure there was a question at the end of that, Stephanie, but if anyone wants to comment on that, otherwise we can.
Just very briefly, let me just emphasize the point that Alberto made, that it isn't just torture we're concerned about, it is CID as well. And I think that's extremely important that we focus on both. And Alberto and Claudia, I think, have put that in front of us very clearly.
I want to
Yes.
make one comment. I mean, perhaps it's not totally related. I think it's very important to reestablish also with tremendous strength the idea that there is not just cause that justifies terrorism. You know, also in my experience, I have seen that those who appear very strong against terrorism in the sense of resorting to measures that are illegal, retroactively are exposed as people that were not so practical and not so political savvy. And again, perhaps that doesn't apply in 100% of the cases. Nothing is 100%. But I think that it's essential and important to establish for the value of the rule of law that there is not just cause that will justify terrorism. There are thousands of just causes. Every one of us believes that we have a just cause. In this hemisphere, indigenous populations, people who are discriminated, people whose property is being attacked when they have worked hardly to get it, or people who are offended because they are poor. And we can go on and on. So I think weakness should not be confused with the enforcement of all the mechanisms that are available to enforce the rule of law. The issue is that torture is not part of those mechanisms, as we have seen, in many societies. So I wanted to start with that.
And I'll make two comments on this. First of all, I think there's been inadequate attention, oversight attention paid to the Department of Justice's role in this entire episode. The CIA has been extensively investigated. The military, DOD, has been extensively investigated. But I think either internally or externally through Congress, the failures of the Department of Justice, the multiple failures, have not been adequately examined. The second point is a little differently, which is the difficulty I've kind of discovered over the years in reconciling the words that we use to describe abuse and the actual reality. There's a gap between words on paper and then the actual suffering experienced by individuals who are victimized by this. And the words obscure the reality in ways that impede a moral understanding of the damage done. And it's a problem. I remember, I didn't understand until recently what stress positions really meant. I kind of imagined different things, but the term stress positions can cover all kinds of activities that aren't evident at all from the words themselves. So it's just a caution to us when we deal in this thing to understand the gap between the words and the reality.
Yes, it wasn't until I read the Senate report that I had ever heard the phrase rectal rehydration, for example. That's not a term that I thought I would ever read in a report about U.S. treatment of prisoners in its custody.
Sherry Krebs, Stanford Law School. So torture is probably the one clear norm that we have in international law. It's jus cogens. It's a complete prohibition. No other possibilities to use in certain circumstances, and no potential different contradictory answers. But then again, we still have so many legal creativity. We have so many violations of this norm. And I was just wondering, isn't it time to acknowledge the failure of the legal discourse that we have around torture and move on to a more moral and political mechanism, instead of just debating the different legal definitions and whether this is enhanced interrogation technique or prolonged mental harm, and then whether this is effective or not effective in reaching the specific goals of torture or whatever interrogation technique it is. Shouldn't we just say this is morally wrong and just take a step back from all these legal discussions and just focus on what's right and what's wrong?
Please, I'm sure everyone has something to say.
Respectfully, I disagree very strongly. The rule of law is absolutely essential and critical. And you cannot simply leave torture, something as serious as torture, that you yourself, I know, enormously oppose, to simply saying it's all a matter of moral judgment. Well, your moral judgment might be this and somebody else's is something else. We must have effective enforcement. And all of international law, of course, struggles with enforcement. All of law, to some extent, struggles with enforcement. But the rule of law is fundamentally what it's all about. The rule of law is about checks on power. We tend to forget that. We tend to look at the sort of the generalized expectations you get from law and the dispute settlement issues. It's about fundamentally checks on power. And if you're going to check torture, you're going to have to do it through law. So there is no escape from that, and the law is pretty good. At the edges, we need to be dealing with it. Claudia is dealing with it. Alberto is dealing with it. The committee's dealing with it. Our country is dealing with it. But the rule of law is fundamental. It's what this society stands for, and it's something that we cannot forget.
I agree with Professor Moore. First of all, outsourcing the debate to moral will create the same type of discussion. If it is not such a solid ground, people will say we'll have the same discussion on the basis of moral. So, second thing, sometimes the questioning of law as a domain where we can debate, and it's based on the assumption that law is the rule of the powerful, and sometimes it creates false conscience. You know, powerful do not need law, the prohibition against torture. Or, you know, look at the struggle to establish as law the freedom of religion, the freedom of thought, the right to vote, the right to have property. I mean, these are values that are the conquest of civilizations, with, in many occasions, imposed on the powerful. And then, and again, not that the powerful are wrong all the time either. I mean, the idea that the weak are always right is also wrong in society. I mean, this is different. But law gives a special meaning to things. You know, I remember when we were doing law against disappearances in Latin America, and I went to some people, said, please sign here stating that it's reprehensible and violates the international canon of civil and political rights. And some people told me, no, well, I will not participate in false conscience promotion. I mean, so what do you have then to argue? I mean, so it motivates people. Some people want to act legally. And these are conquest of civilization. Not that every law is good. I think of countries where law is pretty bad. But, and the prohibition against torture. Now, what have we gotten with this? The Italians have an expression, says chiaro oscuro. Clear and dark at the same time. Perhaps you can capture it through intuition. It's difficult to capture it rational sometimes. But the prohibition has saved lives and have promoted development. Do we have less torture than when we had before 1994? I don't know. But if we would not have provided that mechanism to people, we would have had more tortured people. So that's my view on the matter.
So can I just add one thing to that, because I maybe have a little bit more sympathy for the question than has been expressed. And I say that as somebody who spent the last decade really trying to develop the utilitarian and pragmatic arguments against torture, because I felt the moral arguments were not getting us anywhere. And many people have criticized that as an advocacy strategy, and also criticized the Senate Intelligence Committee report for focusing so much on whether torture, quote unquote, worked. But I'm a pragmatist, and I feel very strongly that was necessary to break the spell that this country at least was under, and having been fed a very steady diet of both anxiety and at the same time assertions that without doing these, engaging in this conduct, Americans would die. But I do think it's very, very important to continue to make the moral argument and for the moral voice to be very strong. That was the animating spirit coming out of the Holocaust, that this is wrong, that this level of human rights violations is fundamentally immoral and undermines the peace and security of the world. So I think it's very important to elevate those voices at the same time that we develop, as Alberto, I think so rightly pointed out, we're a society of lawyers, but it's very difficult, particularly in the context of terrorism, to separate out the political, the practical, and the legal. And we have to take account of all of those things if what we want is to improve, is to make sure that we don't go down this road again. So I appreciate the question.
Hi, my name's Amanda Wetzel. I am a lawyer qualified in New York and Paris and also educated in Northern Ireland. I spent some time studying law there. And it was actually, when I think of the list of costs that have been presented to us as a result of the U.S. torture program, I think that there's one cost that the American people have not felt that people in other societies that have had this similar problem have felt. And I think that that cost is the fact that the torture happened in their country, to their people, and it's divided their society. And so that if you asked people in Belfast if they thought that torture was okay for national security reasons, I don't know what the statistic is, but I would say with 99% certainty that you would not find a significant percentage of people that think that torture is acceptable. And I think that one of our problems in the United States is that we need to have some sort of access to information for people who are not lawyers regarding what the costs of torture are. And I think that, I guess this is more of a comment than a question, but I think that as a society of lawyers, we have an obligation to take a statement on behalf of the president, and I think the position of the lawyers working in the most senior levels at the National Security Council now, that torture is not acceptable, and explain to people why torture is not acceptable and what the costs of torture are. Because our society hasn't felt the costs in the same way that other societies have, and because some of the people who have been subjected to these techniques are people who have sought to hurt us in ways that are reprehensible to many Americans. So I think to bring the problem home, there needs to be a real education effort, and I think that it's a very important education effort, and that it should be just as important as our street law programs that relate to constitutional law, because I think it's a moral issue for the country. So.
I think you make an excellent point. I think every society understands a little more clearly when their own people are the victims of torture. Just to use the analogy for the United States, I think the American people understand very clearly when they hear about the torture of Senator McCain and all of those that were held by North Vietnam, for example, during the Vietnam War, or the torture of some of my wonderful American military clients who were tortured brutally during the war to liberate Kuwait, tortured by Saddam Hussein and the intelligence service. And when you go through that, when you see what's happened to these people, there's no one that's just not enormously in revulsion at this, and understand perfectly the point that Alberto is making of the gap between language and the reality of just how horrible this is.
It also prompts me to want to underscore something that Claudio said, which is the connection between the domestic and the international. And I have to point out that I think it would help us a lot as a country if we would stop thinking about torture as something that only happens outside of the United States, when in fact there are segments of our society for whom this kind of abuse of power is not alien. I mean, we're in the middle now of a process of uncovering decades of official torture by the Chicago Police Department against untold numbers of people, many of whom are serving prison sentences. So I do think it's very important to make that link and to understand the connection between the toleration of that kind of torture, which is clearly what that was, and the acceptance of using that outside of the United States.
Thank you. My name's Jesse Clark. I'm a legal advisor with the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, currently posted to the UK mission to the UN in New York. I wanted to ask a question and draw together two elements. One I think has been well addressed, and perhaps the other we haven't had time to engage in yet. The first is the notion of the cost to American moral and diplomatic power of this torture program. It's been well addressed by the panel. I'd reflect on it in one further way. I was involved in the effort to try and get the Security Council to consider the human rights record of North Korea. Very recently, we had to put that to a procedural vote in the Security Council, and with partners on the Council, including the US, we were successful. Just before that historic meeting took place, North Korea issued a letter circulated to all UN member states in which it engaged in common rhetoric that we're not surprised by. But what it did say was that it was resisting this attempt by the US and its partners. And where the real focus should be is on the 600-page summary of the Senate report. So I think, you know, am I saying that's a good argument? No. Am I saying it's an argument that is happening and costing the US and its partners? I think yes. So coming to my question, the other aspect is accountability. And I wanted to ask the panelists if they'd reflected on whether the US stain or its undermining of its moral and diplomatic authority in this context will ever really be addressed without accountability, including the possibility of individual criminal responsibility of senior government officials. That's a difficult thing for a government lawyer to say. The UK itself is under preliminary examination before the ICC in relation to abuse allegations in Iraq. But I wanted to ask the panel if they had reflections on the antidote to that stain and whether accountability might be part of that answer. Thank you.
I think that's the $1,000 question, and I think first of all, you're exactly right. I mean, law without accountability is really not law at all. And as Claudia pointed out, and as we all know, under the Convention Against Torture, there's an obligation to investigate, prosecute, and punish, which is categorical. And many of our European partners have called on the United States to do exactly this, particularly in light of the Sisi report coming out. Now, the reality in this country, touching again on the political, is that while it's legally unthinkable for there not to be accountability for having committed the crime of torture, it is politically equally unthinkable under current circumstances in the United States to do so. For any number of reasons, but perhaps the principal reason is that there were so many high-level individuals directly involved in the decision to adopt the torture policy and then, of course, the execution of the policy, which is a point that almost all the individuals involved with this policy made when they testified before the various Senate committees. They would always or frequently start out with the opening statement to the effect that everything I did was personally authorized by the President of the United States. And of course, below the President, there was the Vice President, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Defense, the CIA Director, and many, many others. Recently, we've learned that the National Security Council, the full National Security Council, on 3 occasions revalidated the policy approval to engage in the policy. So with that kind of participation in the policy, those who would seek not to have accountability, which are many in this country, are making the point that this would be difficult, perhaps impossible, would tear the country apart and would be politically divisive. All of this is, of course, exactly true. I think accountability will come in time. It'll start with an understanding of what happened, and I think the 2 Senate reports are a big first step in this direction. There's more to be understood and more to be learned about what happened, and I think there's going to be a national debate over time. I think accountability will come, but I think it's going to take longer than we would wish or expect. One other point. What's puzzled me is that we haven't had a more serious discussion about accountability for those acts of torture that exceeded the very broad guidelines provided by the Department of Justice. Even Professor John Yoo, who's one of the principal architects of this, indicated that he felt that some of the interrogation techniques as applied exceeded what was authorized by the Department of Justice. And it seemed to me that accountability for those excesses would be a pretty much nothing slam dunk, but if there would be a slam dunk issue here, it would be that one.
Let me just add 2 points to that very excellent presentation by Alberto that I agree with fully, but Another very special problem for prosecuting anyone in the United States for this, despite the absolute clarity of the CAT, for example, on these points, is that the Office of Legal Counsel, the highest Justice Department office in the United States dealing with legal analysis, had been tasked for issuing an opinion and had issued an opinion. The CIA, for example, had on 4 occasions, as I understand it, asked the Justice Department whether what was being done was lawful, and because they were very worried about it, including their counsel's office, and they were on each occasion told that these activities were lawful. So in that circumstance, it would be extremely difficult, and I think we would all be concerned with some level of fairness issues in the United States in doing that, quite apart from the absolute unequivocal requirements in the CAT treaty. I also think that to some extent, the only thing, having looked at this so far, being the Senate report, sends a little bit of a wrong information that basically this was somehow something rogue operators that began in the CIA. This is much broader than that, as all of our panelists know. This is Abu Ghraib. This is Guantanamo. These are things that came from the Defense Department as well, that involved a number of other very serious settings. And so I think it is important not to be concluding from the one report we have that this is somehow something that originated in the CIA. It did not. This is a particular case in which it originated at a much higher level, and that's what makes the problem, as Alberto indicated, so very difficult politically in the United States. But even in terms of prosecution, when you have the Justice Department in the United States informing people that something is lawful, it makes it extremely difficult to ever be then bringing prosecutions in U.S. courts.
The international obligation speaks by themselves, so I don't need to speak for them. I also would like to say this, even in light of the approvals and so forth, I didn't see any memo stating, I mean, the memo stated and the instruction, something about organ failure and death. And the list of dead people keep being increased as we know more. So we need to see, you know, I'm not going to talk politics here, that's yours, Rion, but law has an influence of politics as well. Say.
Yeah, by the way, the Justice Department memo, of course, from OLC that did these things, as Claudia and Alberto know so well, and I suspect everybody in the audience knows so well, was a complete travesty. It was just an absolute disaster, and basically nothing more than an effort to justify politically or in a policy standpoint what a certain small group of individuals had decided should be done with enormous harm to the rule of law, United States foreign policy, and fighting terrorism.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and we have one more question. So I'm going to refrain from what I was going to say in answer to that question as well, and we'll take, you've got the floor.
Sure. Hi, my name is Matiange Sirleaf. I'm an assistant professor of law at the University of Baltimore Law School. And I've done research on truth commissions in other countries, and I've done field research on truth commissions in other countries. And I was intrigued by your comments earlier, John, because I thought I was the lone soul who thought that a truth commission is something that would actually be really good for a problem like this. For a number of reasons you've already discussed, prosecutions in the U.S. seems like it's foreclosed, both perhaps for legal reasons and for political reasons. A truth commission seems like it would, one, also provide a semblance of accountability, two, have this sort of public consciousness raising function that some of the commentators spoke to earlier. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were, Alberto and Claudio, about a truth commission to deal with this problem that we've been talking about.
Great, thank you. Okay, Alberto.
Actually, John, before we started the panel, was endorsing the Truth Commission. I share his opinion. I think it would be a useful thing, because despite all the good work that's been done by not only the Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee in uncovering some of the facts, there's still a lot that remains unknown. For example, we don't really know much about the rendition program, at least not from the use of official sources that are better understood. The workings of the National Security Council, the White House Communications, the Department of Justice, more at the senior levels other than what's been released. So there's a lot that still remains unknown that could be usefully pursued. I think it's a good idea.
I have a bias in favor of truth commissions. They could perform a useful role if they satisfy certain things. I mean, they need to, what is called here, be bipartisan. I mean, because legitimacy has different components, and one is who is saying what. So it's not only the reasoning and the process, but it needs to be represented. They have been able, in addition to the need to find more things. And so I think it's, the Senate report contributes to the knowledge of facts, and that opens a possibility. I have seen the impact of truth commissions in numerous societies, and on the whole, I think that it's a good idea to think about. And so that's my take for it, and I think it would be great if that could happen.
We are right at, you have one more very quick comment to make, Alberto.
The political dynamic in this country has been an interplay between the discussion about the standards and discussion about accountability. And from the very first start, the fear of accountability has prohibited or impeded a discussion as to the standards. Many people don't want to call or can't call waterboarding torture because they're afraid of that if they were to say that would trigger accountability concerns. So in some respects, we're continuing to be in the worst of all possible worlds. We're in the vicious circle in which one political factor obstructs the other and prohibits us all from restoring the status quo ante conviction against torture. So,
Okay,
won't say more about
Claudia.
that.
Yeah, I think there is indeed a political dynamic, which is not strange. It happened in many countries, you know, when the Truth Commission started. But I think there is another reason for the importance of the Truth Commission. And somebody said that in here, the debate on torture has been a debate on torture as an instrument of foreign policy. Huh? If you take a look at South Africa, Chile, Guatemala, you know, there were hundreds of thousands of people infected. So on the one hand, it says a lot about the moral fiber of the American people that were debating torture when it has been confined to others and sometimes very bad people. So the fact that we have this discussion says something. However, because there hasn't been truth commissions, or the way to know by everyone, still I read, you know, I've seen some research on the amount of persons in the country that believe that torture is justified, and it's pretty high. If you do the same in other countries, you will see that people are convinced that torture doesn't function. Huh? And then, to a certain extent, the Truth Commission could be an instrument to show. I mean, you start the Truth Commission trying to find the truth, you know, but it could be a way then to reaffirm the value of torture. And again, I think you mentioned this. We always reduce things to utilitarian concepts. I mean, I think we all believe that there is a strong moral, and we need to broaden the scope of the moral discourse. Huh? But the idea of the validity of law as an autonomous concept doesn't detract us also to pursue this on moral grounds. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That's a very important point, and I'm glad we had your indulgence to make it. I want to thank the Society for making this the closing plenary, and for again for all of you for being here and grappling with these issues and asking such thoughtful questions. And finally, please join me in thanking this very distinguished panel.
pleasure. I'll call you.
Great.
I'll call you. We'll have a-